and hand over to you, Noel.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you. So now this evening, we're going to be talking about 20th century garden history. And I think probably for most of you, the figure of Gertrude Jekyll will drift into your mind's eye. And Hidcote, and Lawrence Johnson, and all of these sort of classic English gardens. But we're going to be looking at another aspect of 20th century English garden history, arguably one that was far, far more influential. Got on my desk here, English Gardens in the 20th Century by our dear colleague Tim Richardson, subtitle, From the Archives of Country Life. So we can pretty well guess that these are all going to be, seriously posh gardens. And indeed, same authors produced a new English garden, 21st century garden, and looking through, yes, they're all pretty posh. Well, if they're not posh, they've made an awful lot of money in the city. So again, big gardens at scale, expensive gardens. Just thinking back to my childhood, my father took early retirement and made a fantastic garden. If I made my childhood memory, 2 fantastic gardens, which I suppose one of the reasons why I'm sitting here this evening. My father was the son of a Welsh miner. He was an engineering worker. He'd never heard of Gertrude Jekyll, but where did my father get his ideas of how to make a garden from? It's an interesting point. And my childhood, every now and again I'd go up to London with my mother so that she could visit various of her friends who were mostly in South London, very much in suburbia. So those suburban gardens are something, again, that's been certainly very much part of my background. So Michael has written a book essentially looking at the suburban garden of the 20th century, which of course was there were millions of people who were making these gardens. But Michael, you're an academic. You teach at the University of Sussex in Brighton. So how did you come to? Well, tell us a little bit more, please, about who you are and how you came to write this book, which is, by the way, with a wonderful title of Behind the Privet Hedge. Privet, of course, something that does not tend to appear in the Gertrude Jekyll garden.
Thank you for setting up that for me, Noel. Yeah, it's just great to be here. I realise I'm probably among lots of experts in horticulture here, and I'm looking back at your archives. I can see what wonderful speakers you get. I'm not one of those at all. I'm a historian, if you like, but I'm fundamentally a journalist. My whole career has been as a newspaper editor and a website editor. I was editor of the Scotsman and the Belfast Telegraph, among others. So my whole career was in journalism. There's a whole different story about the collapse of journalism in this country, which I shan't bore you with. But looking really to escape that collapsing industry, I wanted to put myself out of my comfort zone, and I ended up taking a master's in garden and landscape history at the Institute of Historical Research in London. And I guess like everybody, when I thought of gardens, I thought of exactly those ones you were talking about, Noel. Either the antiquity, the gardens of the Italian Renaissance with their crazy waterworks, or Repton, and that kind of big landscape, man's imposition on nature. My grandfather was a minor municipal landscape gardener in Gravesend, Kent, and he had an astonishing suburban garden of immaculate exactitude. And I think in the end, when I took this course, just thinking, well, challenge yourself to do something different, I was going to study all those big things that are in Tim's book there, but I ended up channeling him, I think, and I think finding out a good story, an origin story of the suburban garden, I think that has been lost. And so with my journalist instinct and my interest in gardens, it kind of came together to look at why suburban gardens are dismissed, and actually the origin story, which was a really powerful one of people looking for a new egalitarian society in the early part of the 20th century. That's a long way of saying why I kind of came to this subject.
Great. So please, tell us about the central thesis of behind the Privet Hedge is really a biography of one Richard Sudell, who you claim to be the most influential garden writer of the 20th century. Possibly pipped to the post, of course, by Dr. Hessian, who died well into his 90s, very recently, just a couple of weeks ago. All of the British viewers and listeners will all know the name of Dr. Hessian. We will all have several copies of Dr. Hessian's books, but we will not admit to that in polite company. Yes, tell us the story.
Well, yes, I think when I started, the first thing was Richard Sudell was a journalist. He was a garden journalist, and eventually had an enormous audience in the first half of the 20th century and going into the second half, because he became a sort of a suburban garden evangelical, if you like. And I think when I started looking at the gardens, he wrote 47 instruction books, painfully practical garden shed instruction books, to really ride this wave of interest and thirst that came in the early 20th century among newly situated working class people, to learn about gardening. And it was an explosion of magazines and interests. And what happened was eventually became a political, a horticultural battle between the new suburban gardens, if you like, and the sort of country house gardens that you were talking about earlier there, Noel. And I think if you look at in any one of his books, you see quintessential suburban gardens of that time. Those drawings, which you'll see on, will come up on, hopefully on your slides. You'll see, really square. There's one. Look at that. Perfect. That to me is like a Renaissance painting. Perfect quintessential gardens. Crazy pavings. Little bits of Sam Macready coral cluster, little Doric rose beds. You see all those delineated labor-saving spaces that the new suburban gardener of the early 20th century needed, because they were not experts and they had to be guided gently. And straight lines, delineated spaces. I always think of Sudell as the patron saint of crazy paving. Were quintessential parts of the gardens. And what you also see there is kind of is seclusion. And this was really important because the cultural debate of that time, and it was prime time debate, by the way, the growth of suburbia and its gardens, was eschewed. A lot of the cultural critics eschewed this privacy that the Privet Hedge gave, this ending of community. This woman in this picture, was she just only concerned in her own world, if you like? And so these gardens became incredibly political, but they hid, and it still lives today. We all know of the stereotypes of suburban gardens and that kind of curtain twitching, conservative small c sorts of people. But it hid a proper origin story that has been lost along the way, I think. Yes, there were flowers that came at that time, the standard tea roses that were developed for these gardens. But really, I think what happened is the loss of this movement that Sudell was very much a part of, to help create that people could have open air and space from where they came from. And this historical context is very important, because most of these people, certainly in the council estates around London, had come from inner city slums. There's another great Sudell drawing there of one of his gardens, even a little Versailles fountain there, shady repose in the corner, and this kind of walled, privacy given gardens, if you like. And I think just as some example of how these things became political, is almost a war of the roses as well at times, because the rose has always been political, obviously, white, red, etc. But the rose became political in that part of the of time as well, because there was a kind of face-off, if you like, and this was actually a proper debate between the standard tea roses that were bred for the new suburban gardens, with glorious names like the Betty Up Richard, and the more older roses, if you like the Madame Louis Levac, and from the old order of gardens. One of those, Betty and Madame Louis, was found in the new suburban gardens, and I think you can all guess what they are, which one it was. But Betty was bred to withstand inner city pollution, and she became a staple of the suburban garden in the early half of the 20th century. And that, for what she became, for some people, some cultural critics, the gardeners themselves were not involved in these debates, became what was vulgar about the suburban garden. She was blousy, a little gauche. Oh, there she is. Look, and there are the two of them that were. So there was a backlash, a genuine backlash against these tea roses from people, the Madam supporting people like Vita Sackville-West and Gertrude Jekyll. And the Frankenthal name really just denoted the class connotations of this thing. So it set up a battle between the country house chocolate planting of Jekyll and Robinson against the labour-saving formal garden of which Sudell was involved in. But why are we talking about this? And I think it's quite important, really, to just bring a little bit of historical context about why land and garden was so prime time debate at this time. And that's because after the First World War, there was huge tumult in Britain socially. This is a Roehampton estate, a London County Council estate, cottage garden estate, now called Dover House, started in 1920, and it was part of Lloyd George's loosely thinking Homes Fit for Heroes campaign. Bear in mind, there were 600 families without houses after World War I. Many of the people who fought in the war were seen as unfit. Lloyd George, looking over his shoulder at the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, realized that something needed to be done. These people coming back from this war who'd lived through this horror were not going to accept the social place they had before, i.e. terrible, terrible slums, and particularly in London, Manchester and Birmingham. So it's worth bearing in mind that in the interwar period, around 5 million houses were built under this, loosely speaking, under Homes Fit for Heroes. 3 million in the private sector and over 1 million by councils. Just bear that in mind when we talk about today. These were homes for rent at the times, driven by acts of parliament and driven by disciples of Ebenezer Howard's Garden City movement. Its chief advocate of this time with the Homes Fit for Heroes was Raymond Unwin. It was part of the design team for Letchworth Garden City. And he really drove something called the Tudor Waters Committee, which said all these new houses, to get planning permission, there must be 12 houses to the acre. And for the first time, back or side gardens of 400 square yards for these people to come up. So if you remember back to that picture of Dover House there, what you saw was the house, which was something people had hitherto never dreamed of. But what you saw outside was 400 of claggy clay. That was all that was left for these people. They didn't get a garden when they moved in. They got the open space, which they loved, and then took it from there. And this is where Sudell came in. These kind of movements really, as well as the Garden City movement, came from sort of benevolent industrialist Quakers like George Cabry, who built Bourneville, obviously, Titus Sawthill, and William Lever at Port Sunlight, sorry. So the LCC, London County Council, took the lead. Roehampton was an arts and crafts home to 2,000 homes. Becontree across town, 26,000 homes. Downham in London too, 6,000 homes. These people had arrived in the land of milk and honey. And of course, as you see there, Metroland was part of the speculative private building as well, and was the subject of real ridicule, the mock Tudor Beaton, etc. Built by the Metropolitan Railway, which went out from Baker Street to Aylesbury to Uxbridge and Stanmore, and they originally wanted to go up to the northeast. An enterprising official of the Metropolitan Railway started thinking we could parcel up land along this railway route and sell a new bucolic lifestyle. Ribbon development was the start of, obviously, and Metroland became obviously the subject of ridicule. John Betjeman's famous poem Middlesex, with his great line saying, "Out into the outskirts edges where a few surviving hedges keep alive our lost Elysium." Rural Middlesex again. And this fear that what was happening with the suburbs was it was destroying rural Italy was real. And they were really contested years because many critics, many people thought that Britain could build something bolder. And what we got instead was was the suburbs. Here is my hero, Richard Sudell, with his second wife, Ida. He's a great way into this debate. He left school at 14. He was an apprentice gardener in Preston. His father was a hay salesman, often poor because of agricultural depressions in Lancashire. They came from a Quaker family. And he moved on to Roehampton Estate with Emily, his first wife. Might be ironic, you think, that he got a house under the Homes Fit for Heroes thing, because Richard Sudell was a conscientious objector, and he was an absolutist conscientious objector, one of only 1,600 who refused any exemption under the Military Conscription Acts. Quakers were talking around their peace testimony at the time. Richard had got his dream job at Kew as an apprentice when the Military Conscription Acts came in, and he fled there to avoid conscription to the Woodbrook College, which was George Cadbury's Quaker college in Birmingham. And there he was arrested, jailed 3 times, astonishing hardship in prison, no mattresses, solitary confinement, bread and water, and it really was as grim as that. But he stuck it out right to the end. However, he was one of the only few people, and this is where politics and horticulture starts to come in, where on a period of furlough, he worked for something, and he led something called the Vacant Land Cultivation Society in London, where he used his horticultural knowledge to help the VLCS, run by an American philanthropist called Joseph Fells, to take land in London, and land that was derelict or wasn't being used for development during the war, to grow vegetables, grow flowers, get everybody to take over derelict bits of London. And the Vacant Land Cultivation Society was the start of a joining together of Richard Sudell's politics and culture and gardens. And when he moved on to Roehampton, he created a fearsome garden force in a couple of years. As I said, these people had open space for the first time, but they didn't know anything, frankly, didn't know what to do with it. So the Roehampton Garden Society, which Sudell formed, was the start of that kind of garden show thing, the kind of explosion of garden shows, Biggest Marrows, sports galas. Richard Sudell did instructions for these people, showed them how to turn that clay into really gardens, and hence the reason why those gardens had to be simple. They bought communal lawnmowers so that people didn't have to buy them. Seeds were built, and the Roehampton Garden Society grew in huge numbers in a very small period of time. And this was happening all over London, by the way, not just in Roehampton. But before we do that, I just want to get back to that debate around the suburbs, just very briefly, if I can. This was primetime debate, as I say. Now, these 4 characters here are interesting because they are part of what dominated the airways about suburbans and suburban gardens. William Howell on the left with the moustache there, it was a modern movement architect. And I just want to give you some quotes to tell you, just give you some idea about the horror that the suburbs and the suburban garden took at these times. Howell said, "We need to turn the tide back from the suburban dream. This is what we must do. We don't want to rush out and live in horrid little suburbs and semi-detached houses." D.H. Lawrence in the middle, who knew a thing or two about working class men and their love of flowers, nevertheless called suburbs horrid little red rat traps. "Make a New England," he said, "away with little homes, away with scrabbling pettiness and paltriness." Clough William Ellis, the next one up, the designer of the Italian curiosity at Portmeirion in North Wales, called suburbs full of mean and petty houses that surely none but mean and petty little souls should habit within satisfaction. And again, our friend Betjeman, "Dear Middlesex, vanished country friend, your neighbour killed you. Your neighbour London killed you in the end." And this was on the BBC, primetime debate about these things, as modernists and cultural critics dominated the airways to damn this spread of suburbia. And what happened after that was that the heroes of First World War, if you like, became, in these views, shrunken into their back gardens. There was a cartoon at the time in the best-selling newspaper, the Daily Express, called Stroob's Little Man. And there he is. I don't think I need to say any more about that, because that's the World War hero shrunken into his place. The Diary of Mr. Pooter, around at the time, and nobody who was just involved in his garden and wanted to keep himself to himself. Alison Light, the cultural critic, said interwar suburbs fostered a private and domestic conservative modernity. And David Matness, a brilliant cultural landscape critic, talked about a feminized Englishness retreating from expansive imperial masculinities. I mean, this went all over out of the heads of most of the people in the suburbs, by the way. But this was nevertheless the debate that was going on. And when you look at, there's a really another good War of the Roses thing that's so near Roehampton, now called Dover House. Literally 10 minutes away is Bill Howell, William Howell, you saw before, his Alton estate. So what you see there is Alton estate and the Roehampton estate. They were built 40 years apart, 2 miles apart, roughly speaking, for the same sorts of people that were moving out of inner cities, but only 40 years apart. And Hal and his cohorts talked about great new buildings going up into the sky, that could save rural Italy, that could save 80% of London from spread, they thought. Meanwhile, arts and crafts architects started to build things like the Dover House estate there. And they detested the privatizing spaces, did Howell and his courts, that the garden, as you see there, gave people. But actually, if you look nowadays, you know what I'm probably going to say. The place on the left has had a history of real problems. That had architects salivating those buildings there, called Highcliffe. But if you read, just go online now and have a look at the news, and there's a headline out not so long ago in My London, the big London website, which says the rundown London estate on the edge of posh Richmond Park, where some days it's hell. There are no gardens. You look down onto green space that is colonized by grey squirrels. So this was the kind of debate that was happening around buildings and gardens. And what I think it does is it hides the origin story, because by saying that these people were conservative curtain twitchers, which is absolutely what they did, they hid the real story. And the real story I wanted to, by way of illustration, I want to talk about something called the London Gardens Guild, which Sudell was secretary of and was the driving force from it. It was set up by Noel Buxton MP and the Reverend Rollo Meyer. In fact, they were friends, and they came from Oxford. And there was this whole network of people, of nonconformist Christians, radicals, politicians, who saw landscape as a way of lifting the spirits of poor people, just in the same way that public health would as well. There was no difference in their mind. And they set up something with Sudell as a secretary called the London's Garden Guild, which Roehampton became a member of. They'd been taken by Canon Samuel Barnett. His wife Henrietta built the Hampstead Garden suburb. Here is, I'll just talk to that picture in a minute, but they've been taken before the First World War by Samuel Barnett around Whitechapel and Spitalfields. And the poverty they saw there was shocking. But even in Whitechapel and Spitalfields, just every now and again in those tenements, they saw window boxes where people were just planting flowers where they could. The spirit lifting power of the flower was important. And so they set up the London Garden Guild for the new suburbs and the inner city people left behind to do exactly what you see in that picture. These people, by the way, so early on the left there is the King's Gardener, Thomas Hay. Noel Buxton's in the middle. And the president of the RHS, Lord Lambourne, is judging what the LGG set up as the London Gardens competition. Everywhere across the country, people had garden competitions, window boxes, front gardens. These things became hugely popular and spread across. And people like Marjorie Allen joined, Clifford Allen, Cadbury, Fells, and Samuel and Henrietta Barnett came together to get on with trying to lift spirit, even without the government's help. And the next one is another great example of look at that. That's what I was talking about there. Is that gaudy, or is that a astonishing triumph of beauty over circumstance? Window boxes everywhere for competitions. The competition that the London Garden Guild ran for largely working class, but not only, but largely working class people, as we called them at the time, was as big as the RHS Chelsea Flower Show. The London Gardens exhibition, which was a winner's showcase, was huge. But in 1928, there were 13,000 entries in the London Gardens competition. And by 1937, there were 50,000 entrants. When they had the exhibition to showcase the winners, 15,000 spectators queued to get in. That's how big and successful it was. We all know about the Chelsea Flower Show, but we don't know much about that. We don't know anything about the London Garden Guild shows nowadays. And it's worth pointing out as well, there was a new rurality through these gardens. These are Roehampton Gardens, prize winning in the London Gardens Guild, by the way. I'm really sorry they're not in colour, obviously, but it's worth pointing out that 500,000 acres and more of new garden were created in the interwar years, replacing a countryside that, frankly, for all the people talking about protecting rural Italy, these people had no access to anyway. This was a new rurality, in my opinion. 70% of houses had gardens by World War II, and these are prize-winning ones from Roehampton, as I say. And you know, what you started to see with these gardens was a really important community thing as well. The front gardens had to add to the beauty of the overall estate. This was really important. Don't forget, these were the days of bowler-hatted uh, inspectors from councils going around with clip sheets looking at houses and gardens. Front garden had to be ornamental, bringing a smile for the face. Some privet hedge, of course, was there. Standard roses, pyrocanthus maybe in the walls. I'm going to be careful. I know who I'm talking to here, so I'm going to skip through this. But you know, there was the start of those circular beds, triangular beds in the front lawns that usually were with standard roses, ribbons of pansies maybe around the borders, or if you wanted a bed, if you wanted to be bold, sweet peas and snapdragons. The back garden, as I say again, had, you know, crazy paving. Possibly you could put time in it so it gave off smell as you walked it, but it was straight, delineated, and really importantly, at the back of the garden was space always for growing food. Sudell was absolutely certain of this. Bear in mind, we're still rationing and things like that. That everybody had to have a piece at the back of the garden. First for potatoes because they were easy, and then move on to slightly different and other foods. But there was always your outdoor room should have a little shade, somewhere to sit. Dahlia, rose, sundial, or archway caught the house, but definitely at the back. And that need for advice, he started off at the Roehampton Gazette, which is on the left there, a little parish pump magazine. He wrote for it for 5 years, but very quickly he started writing books because he had a knack for it. And very quickly, riding the tail of working class companies, Oddham's Press this time, taking over things, he got the job at Ideal Home, a curious magazine set up for suburbanites with homes of great aspiration, but painfully practical gardening advice. And Sudell was the gardening editor of Ideal Home for years. He then went on very quickly after that to the Daily Herald, which was the biggest selling newspaper at the time, a working class newspaper. He went, bear in mind, as a boy, he left school at 14. And this is where I say he was so influential. He had 2 million readers a week in the Daily Herald. He wrote 47 books, wrote cigarette cards. Remember the cigarette cards that came out, cigarette packets. So this explosion of advice, but it could occasionally lead to anxiety, because it wasn't just Sudell and his labour-saving gardens. It was dear old William Robinson and his Garden Illustrated were giving advice as well. And the aspirational working class people who took these to heart with sometimes disastrous mistakes. If you saw this in colour, I'm pretty sure it would be a cacophony, a riot, a migraine-inducing thing, shrinking the Victorian villa into a very small, I think this is in Downham, into a suburban garden. And you know what happened was the very thing that these people wanted, which was acceptance. What happened instead for lots of them were doing this was ridicule for what they were doing. So there was a real anxiety around these new gardeners at the time. And maybe we should take a little detour, if we can, into another way our meanings change. People used to visit these estates, Downham and things like that. And one lady I quote in the book was saying, it was wonderful. There were little bridges, gnomes and things that she saw in the gardens. Gardens were described as twee, with those rockeries and gnomes, and of course the half sunburst front doors, which we all know about it. But the gnome is interesting, really, because when first imported by Sir Charles Isham in 1847 into his estate at Lamport Hall, he described them as earth spirits, and they were wildly successful, seen as incredible additions to the landscape. 50 years later, though, transferred to the suburban garden, they'd taken on a very different meaning. George Orwell led the charge against rock features, concrete bird baths, crazy paving, and red plaster elves. There's a really good book, if I can recommend, called Done Roaming, by 3 academics, one of which is Paul Oliver. And he says about the Gnome, I just quote this, he says, through their laughing, jovial expressions, though their laughing, jovial expressions may seem to invite the visitor, they inhabit the garden in a manner that inhibits any invasion. They face the road as a miniature uniformed army, at ease but watchful, which kind of sums up what people thought about those gardens at the time. But I want to get back to something about beautification and the political swirl, which has been forgotten, I think. And another couple, if you any of your viewers here today have time, it's worth looking at the history of a couple called Alfred and Ada Salter of Bermondsey. They were settlement radicals, pacifists. Alfred was the MP for Bermondsey. They're the ones with the spades, by the way. And Ada was the first ever London female mayor, by the way. Alfred was a hugely talented doctor who had a whole chance to go and do, Harley Street was waiting for him. But what they did is they went down to Bermondsey at that time. People died of starvation in Bermondsey at that time. Scarlet fever and TB were rife. And they set up, which I think is really remarkable, on Bermondsey Council, they actually set up with a committee that was just as powerful as anything else, the Beautification Committee. And Sudell helped them with this. Ada was on the London Gardens Guild. So what they did is they planted cherry trees wherever they could. They moved old graveyard stones to the outside so they could make playgrounds for children. Because there was nowhere to play. This was fetid dockside. They lined up cherry trees every day. They brought window boxes and as I say, playgrounds. This, they even brought solarium over to help fight children with TB. But this attempt to lift them up. So they had a public health committee, but the Beautification Committee had just as much power. And later after that, Alfred bought Fairby Grange down in Kent. It was a rest home for Bermondsey mothers who had terrible troubles with childbirth. Infant mortality was 3 times higher than anywhere else in London. But eventually, with Sudell's help, Fairby Grange supplied all of the flowers and bulbs and trees and plants and vegetables for Bermondsey Council. And it was an absolutely remarkable thing, which is now largely forgotten. There is a statue to Alfred and Ada on the South Bank, but really very much worth looking into much deeper. That would be enough, I think, from Sudell as a 14-year-old boy, if it ended there. But it didn't, because Richard Sudell was the founder of effectively professionalized landscape architecture. He was the founder of what became known as the Institute of Landscape Architects. Here he is in a meeting with the Town Planning Institute. He's at the front with the bald head. And if you see just slightly leaning away, that's Geoffrey Jellicoe there, who they were very friends, but argued a lot at this time. As he was growing his practice in 1928, Sudell's Gower Street office was the site of the first ever meeting for this, what became known as the ILA. Geoffrey Jellicoe, George Dilliston, Brenda Colvin, Marjorie Allen were all there. And what Sudell saw was that if they didn't organize, landscape would lose in the battle of the reimagining of Britain, so that people would plonk, well, hereby there's a lesson for today, would plonk houses, plonk buildings, but landscape architecture would have no seat at the top table. However, Sudell's background, his association with the suburban gardens, led Gilbert Jenkins, who was at the meeting today, to whisper in Jellicoe's ear, we must get Sudell out of the chair and Thomas Mawson in. Thomas Mawson, much more high profile, if arguably, well, let's not go there. Sudell was only made president in 1955. And I think his background said against him, even though he really did do as much as he could to found professionalize and it was a battle to, as I say, to get it into the national consciousness. After the war, he kept saying, if we need to rebuild and reimagine Britain, and we've got to be a part of it. These were times when people talk about national planning policy, Patrick Abercrombie from the CPRE, for example. But Sudell said everything open to the sky should be ours to be involved in and plan. And they were really internal battles at the time, with Sudell pushing Jellicoe to go further than Jellicoe, although he saw that the idea wanted. And he also saw the ILA could be a way of professionalizing, that local authorities looking for kite-marked, if you like, practitioners would come to the ILA. And they did. They did aerodromes, they did petrol stations, they did gas holders. This is one of Sudell's it doesn't got many works, but this is one of his works designing the gardens, very formal French-style gardens, really, looking at the streamlined modern building, which was the headquarters for de Havilland aircraft. And this was one of his things. He used to say, "We'll see everyone will see our mistakes from the air when planes go up when planes flights took off, as they did." But as you can see there, a letter to Geoffrey Jellicoe, with cities going down like ninepins. This was in the First World War. It is our job to see a new Britain arrives, unlike the old. And everything open to the sky. So cemeteries, for example. I mean, Sudell designed a lot of this kind of fairly mundane stuff. He wasn't of the It didn't get the work that that Colvin and Sylvia Crowe and these people got. But this is his design of the memorial garden at the City of London Cemetery in Manor Park. And it is an incredible plonking. I mean, this is a great cemetery. If you've ever been there, it's a wonderful cemetery of Victorian ostentation to the great and the good. Plonked is a suburban garden type thing in the middle of this from Sudell. David Lambert said that the design had close and reassuring affiliations with the domestic gardens of the mourners, and you wouldn't disagree with David there, would you? And there were other things like battles over the M1, for example. Sudell and Jellicoe went to the Ministry of Transport when that road was being built and said, we must landscape it. It has to be landscaped properly. What happened, of course, is they didn't take any landscape architects on. The house of outrage is that straight line M1 went off with its big clunky bridges. Meanwhile, over in Germany, the autobahns were being designed following the contours of the land and the rest of it. But there was also things like sports fields, the National Playing Fields Association, which they joined. And this one here is probably the only work I would say of Sudell, which still remains. This is Dolphin Square in Pimlico, which was under a huge amount of threat recently, but was saved. I had a very small role in this. Mainly, it was a fantastic Doughty residence and a landscape architect called Annabel Downs, who helped to save this and get it registered. And it's the first time really that by Historic England, the first time really that Sudell's role in that early part has been recognised. And it says that, as it says there. And it's worth going because it's now Sally Prothero who is having to redesign it, but what she's doing is bringing the ethos of Sudell back. The original plans would have cut that garden in half. And it really is a remarkable collection of suburban gardens, absolutely quintessential sort of suburban gardens in a courtyard in the middle of London. So I think, where I think Sudell was and where he's been lost is he was there every Saturday as people tried to copy him in his books, whether it's PG tip cards. He took over the Mr. Middleton books as well. But I think what that was, he was radical. I think it was really radical because deep down in the soil, he was literally helping to change Britain inch by hard dug inch. And there he is doing one of those, showing readers how to do one of those circular beds. He was secretary of the Prison Gardeners Association, the National Playing Fields Association, the National Allotment Association, and finally, president of the ILA. And even now, when you look at Dover House, where he lived before, I mean, the thing there is I mean, people, you can't rent very much in there anymore, but and houses go for, bottom floor of these houses go for about 800,000, and some of the front gardens have been ripped up. But what that ethos of housing shows that with arts and crafts and gardens together, you can create. If you walk around Dover House now, it's preserved from. You can't hear the A3 traffic. Little things pop up to surprise, and little gardens everywhere and to the side of the thing. It's very modest but very beautiful. I think you'll see that if you just move on a bit there, Noel, that you can see that there's some pictures of Dover House as it is now. And there's little places for children to play and things like that. So I just conclude really by saying I think the history of this garden stuff has been stopped, has been forgotten. There was no way these gardeners would be able to design country house gardens. I mean, it's worth bearing in mind, obviously, that Gertrude Jekyll had 11 full-time gardeners at Munstead Wood to help her garden look natural and wild. And these people just could not do that. So these suburban gardens were of their time, but they are, in my view, they gave the greatest opportunity for cultural expression in the 20th century for a mass of people. And yes, they evolved over the time, and they're not quite as they are now. And of course, we talk about wild planting and all the rest of it. But I think what Richard Sudell does, he's our confluence, really. He takes us in to that debate and that kind of time when there was change in the air. And the gardens weren't seen by these people as something for curtain twitchers and people to withdraw from society. They were seen as the right for open air and land and exercise for a whole range of new people. And I think he also allows us to go out of that garden gate and is our conduit into the thoughts and arguments of horticulturalists, architects, politicians and campaigners, grasping for new definitions of land. I think that debate was lost, in my humble opinion. I think you have to look at London. I took a journey. I go in the intro to the book. I take a journey to Roehampton from my house on the south coast, and I drive past. Sorry, the train takes us past Battersea Power Station, and if you want to see an example of devil may care, laissez-faire, chuck it up, money talks development. That's it. That's almost a symbol of how architects and landscape architects lost the battle in it. So that's really, I guess, just a flavour of what I think was important and what I submit has been partially lost.
Marvelous, thank you. Gosh, that was a real tour de force. Here's the book, everybody. It was a good read. I really enjoyed it, and as well as just sort of learning so much. So when you walk around suburbia today, I know you've talked about the horrors of new developments in Battersea, etc. But walking around these sort of 1920s, 1930s, 1950s London suburbs, obviously we have lost so much to that appalling development of turning front gardens into car parks, with all the effects on water flow and all that follow. But do you still see that suburban gardens are still influenced by Sudell, or do you feel that there's been a complete move away from what he was trying to teach us?
I mean, yes, well, I think there's two. I think obviously the country house, Jekyll still exists, obviously it does. But I still think in certain areas and smaller areas that labour-saving delineated garden is there. And I think it still exists. My worry, though, is that I think that all new building, what we're seeing now, is not even a chance. Forget Jekyll v Sudell. There isn't anything there. And I think if you look, and it's what worried me about when Angela Rayner last year said she was going to remove beauty from all planning laws and building these 1.5 million houses. Now, I look at, Annie and I were talking just before we came on about new developments. If you look at the new developments of executive housing, there's no space for gardens. There's space for the SUV and the double garage. But I don't see any kind of attempt to build open space like we did back in there. And we always think, don't we? Oh, it's 100 years ago. We're progressing now. But actually, I think we have a lot of lessons to learn from 100 years ago that we're in danger of losing.
Michael, can I ask? I always think it's fascinating. Why did you write the book? I mean, where did you get the idea? Where did that come from? And how long were you thinking about it before you thought, right, I'm going to do it?
Yeah, it was. I think the first one when I heard he was a journalist, because when you're doing a degree where you're really looking at new stuff for the first time, you latch on to things that he's a journalist. It was just mentioned as a side. He was a journalist on a state, and he drove this, gardening force, and that was all it was said. It was one line, and I thought, there's a story. Who is this chap? Who is he? And I'd never, obviously Annabel Downs had done the Oxford dictionary book, a small excerpt of him, but then I found out and got in touch with his family, found out he was a conscientious objector, found out his Quaker background, found out his battles within the ILA, and suddenly there was this huge story just gathering together.
Amazing.
He is at confluence, he kind of touches everywhere,
Yeah.
So yeah, that was it, and I suddenly thought, I'm onto something here. And then when I did it as a dissertation, a professor just said to me, there's a book in this, you've got to do it, because and I just thought, well, let's do it.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, why not? I mean, it's almost like, why hadn't somebody written that book? Why wasn't this out there? Why, because it is so important, isn't it? And there were so many gardens in if you look at all the houses that had gardens in relation to the posh houses that had posh gardens, they outnumber them, so the importance in terms of numbers there and day-to-day life. I mean, it's sort of so obvious, and yet nobody did it.
I think going back sorry, Annie, sorry to interrupt. Going back, I think if you look at garden and landscape history, for example, everybody very people who light on the 20th century. It's like the 20th century, well, it's too near, and but so it's like I said, when I started, I thought, well, I'll end up doing Villa d'Este or something like that, and then I ended up doing Dun roaming. because I think there's a better story there that's untold. And you know, if you look at the book, look at other books, for example, there are not many books on 20th century landscape in the way that there are on, you know, further back, in my view.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting how crazy paving and hybrid teas have held on to that sort of loathe for the cognoscenti, and yet in the States, actually, crazy paving is just fine, you know, and can look really groovy and looks great, and there isn't this sort of you know, this thing that, you know, we all sort of sneer at, and yet actually it's very sustainable because you're using up bits of paving, you're making that, you know, you're not having to cut so much, you can piece it together. I mean, there's a lot of sustainability there. So it's and I wonder how soon that sort of those sort of things will actually not be in people's consciousness, because people won't think, crazy paving, that's a thing of the 30s, 40s, 50s, you know, oh, it's, you know, that's so old fashioned. Yeah.
Well, I maybe, you see, there's this, the whole class thing is, and pointers of class are so important. I mean, just remember when we always used to look down rather on dahlias. Then Christopher Lloyd planted dahlias, and suddenly everyone was growing dahlias. Then I'm sure if some, we won't mention any names, but one of our garden design colleagues were to do crazy paving at Chelsea, maybe they would finally get respectability. And
yeah, there's that. I don't know who wrote it now, but there's that book, wasn't there? You and Non-You. A few years
yes,
ago.
Nancy Mitford, and then there was I think it was Alan Titchmarsh actually who wrote the garden version.
I think it was someone called. But anyway, it was a take on Mitford's book.
Yes,
and you know, so the marigold was Non-You, and I think those things still.
French marigold was Non-You, the English marigold.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. And those things still do. I think they still do hold. You know.
Fantastic. No, it's absolutely fascinating. It really is, because it was such an amazing time in history anyway, with so many different things going on, so much happening, and so many amazing people doing stuff, you know, that it's very easy for that to just get swept under the carpet for other bigger, you know, more so-called important things. Yeah. Brilliant.
I mean, my thing would be, I mean, you know, when we're talking about these 1.5 million homes, for example, you know, where are the landscapers currently in that debate? You know, where are they? Are they now, or is it just going to be Barrett and Bellway? You know, this is the fear that we lose opportunities to create a better country, and we lost that opportunity after the Second World War. You know, when laissez-faire came in and people kicked out any idea of, you know, this terrible word that planners is such a dirty word now, isn't it? You know, just you know, it's such a dirty word, but you know what, they can do a good job.
Exactly.
We had some good nice comments coming up in the chat. Tanya Duarte asking if there's really any good examples good contemporary examples that you can give us of that benefit more deprived or working class communities.
I mean, the new towns, obviously, that came out after the Second World War. I mean, if you look at Sylvia Crow's, what was she? Which did she get involved in? Where landscape people worked with new towns, they did work. Where they were just an afterthought, you know, obviously Jellicoe did. I've moved on to new towns now, but Sylvia Crow's Newtown experience is still beautiful, in my opinion. And I think that's still there. But actually, I must admit, if you're talking about really modern, I don't really see many now. I mean, there's lots of different ways of doing things now, like, you know, the plants that are growing up sides of buildings, all the rest of that greening of area. I think that is good. And guerrilla gardening, by the way, you know, that kind of stuff is still around. And I think, you know, that you know, I used to work in Brighton, and you know, perhaps you'd expect it in Brighton. But you know, guerrilla gardening is alive and well in Brighton everywhere you go. You know, and,
Oh, really?
and it's great to see bits of land that was scrabbled, guerrilla garden. You know, so there are different kinds of movements. But I don't. The short answer is, by the way, it's worth a trip to Dover House. It's a conservation area, and it is beautiful. It really is beautiful. Yeah.
Fantastic. I'm trying to span housing, that's it. I was trying to think of the name. I mean, was span a little bit sort of middle class though, or I mean in terms of because I'm thinking that the landscaping around span housing was
Yeah.
it was considered, and actually still stands up. There's a lot of people still live in span housing, and the, you know, but were we looking at a sort of middle class that were?
I don't think so. I think you're absolutely right, Annie.
Yeah,
I think
yeah, yeah,
that's another good example. As
yeah.
are, by the way, the kind of those kind of, you know, Jaywick Sands and Peacehaven, those buildings that grew up all,
Mm,
you know, organically. I don't know what they
mm,
call them now, but you know, where you see different gardens. You see these crazy gardens where you've got a giant squirrel and a little gnome and things like that. But they're all really kind of,
yeah,
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 they would be seen as vulgar still, but
yeah.
they are, like I said before, they're a real great example of cultural expression. You know.
Yeah, and the fact that cars were removed from, you know, you
Yeah.
walk through gardens to get to the houses. The
Yeah.
cars were not parked in front of a window, you know, like they are now. You
Exactly.
know,
Yeah, no,
yeah,
you're
no,
absolutely right.
no, it is such a fascinating subject. Gosh, well done you. What a brilliant book to write.
Well,
Yeah,
thank you
yeah,
very much.
yeah. No, it's there's so much to think about there. There's so much to think about, and so many interesting people to now research as well.
Yes, no, it's been a yeah, really important topic, and one of sort of great pertinence to today. So thank you very much, Michael, for joining us this evening, and we look forward to, I think, continue to hear more about this very rich vein of research.
There is actually there's one comment that one of the first comments that came in from Rachel saying, riveting. As a former reporter made redundant by what Michael described as the collapsing journalism industry, I too am fascinated to find out more about Sudell and Salters et al. So yeah, I think that's
Oh,
really,
that's great. That's
yeah.
great. Oh well, maybe she and I will know a lot of different subject about the collapse of journalism. But,
Yes, yes, yeah.
yeah, there's always opportunities afterwards. I mean, if it hadn't collapsed, I probably wouldn't have written this book, to be honest. So.
Yeah. Well, no, it's brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, it's
Thank you.
really fascinating. All the best. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.